Okay, finishing up chapter 12. Um, Looking at the overall slave society. Talked about in the last one, culture and the family culture. Middle passage, when we had an international slave trade, is where, the passage, and then you can kind of see the directions here. Now, after 1808, technically there wasn't any international slave trade, but smuggling did occur. And that would be basically the logistics of how they would fit in. Very, very tight quarters. International slave trade, some more on that too. Auctions, very, very common. South slave trade would function, and treating people as livestock and evaluating them for their value. Okay, so religion, when it came to kind of the overall religion, the slave culture was very central, very dynamic. It also was a combination of African and Christian elements. Slaves often found comfort in religion. There's a hope of a better world. Many slaveholders encouraged Christianity, and then they would a lot of times use Bible scripture evidence as rationale for slavery. A lot of the song kind of easing labor, working in the fields, so a lot of people would sing. The idea of like the invisible institution is that there was those who also take a lot of the ideas within religion and some messages and things like that. An invisible institution meaning it's not something you could see, but people could spread the ideas and the songs and keep that secret. Rebellions, most organized resistance was with the slave rebellions. They were never largely successful, but they did happen, at least few. The 1800 Gabriel Prosser, he came up with a plan near Richmond to capture the governor, kill all the whites, but his failed. He and all of his conspirators were hanged. You have 1822 Denmark Vesey in Charleston. They also failed to have a successful rebellion, and a lot of anti-slave legislation is going to kind of result from that. And then Nat Turner in 1831 believed it was his divine mission to lead a slave rebellion, began killing the owner and the family, the owner's sons, and continued the process down the road on other farms. Overall, killed 57 whites. Federal troops and the militia had to stop the rebels, and it terrified a lot of white Southerners, led to more fear, harsher laws, and a lot of other rebellion types and styles would be not just through armed rebellions, but running away was really common, faking illness, sabotaging equipment or crops, or just overall resources on farms and plantations, destroying crops and livestock. A lot of kind of backwards ways of rebelling, and those are those three I just talked about. Culture of the southern frontier overall. You do have some migration that's going to occur, especially as people wanted to, planners who want to be the self-made man. Southern sons are going to want to make it on their own. A lot of women were underrepresented among the migrants. The farther west you go, the more that they are kind of valued and seen as more representation. You do have a very dominant masculine culture, especially in the frontier. A lot of young men did a lot of activities that probably would not have been approved of in a more civilized or developed kind of community. But the South itself was very distinct. Cash crops, agricultural base, very dependent on slavery. Protecting the slavery with the political leaders and the economic policies. There is more violence in the South. A lot of people that were involved in more fights and more aggression, I think that pretty much sums up chapter 12 for us. So I am going to pause for a minute, and I'm going to switch over to chapter 13, and we'll start that video to make the most of our time. Okay, picking up with the first part of chapter 13, looking at basically the change that we're going to look at with rationale, enlightenment ideas, revival, basically second great awakening, and all the things that are going to come out of that. So looking at why the second great awakening started and what were some of the long-term effects. So coming into this first part of it with enlightenment ideas, enlightenment ideas are going to be kind of taking off in terms of this kind of rationalism, republicanism, and the U.S. was starting to get to a point where we had a lot of contrast in growing pains, tension. We read about that in some of those documents you did last unit, where we were growing so fast it was really hard for us to kind of keep us and our ideas together. Religious revival kind of comes in when churches and religions see competition or danger with more rational thought versus religious beliefs. So there was some combination between that rationalism and religion, and a couple of new denominations that came up from that. Deism was definitely one of the more dominant ones. Deism was the idea that, or they believed that God planned the universe, built it, set it in motion, then left it to work on its own. That the universe would just kind of develop and run and function based on natural law. So a lot of people that relied on and firmly believed in all parts of natural law. So things like John Locke. Those who were major deists included Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin. After the French Revolution, deism becomes even more popular in the cities, college students especially, and trying to kind of grasp natural laws of the universe as opposed to other denominations. Many denominations felt very threatened by the emergence of this rational religious idea. The Unitarians emphasize oneness and benevolence of God, inherent goodness of mankind over reason. Those who were still talking about Unitarianism, people who kind of went along this, goes along with people who kind of go with congregational churches. Sorry, somebody walked in. I totally lost my train of thought. Literary men, elites, professors, a lot of the wealthy are going to be kind of the groups that go along with that. Universalism, stress salvation of all men and women, not just those who were predestined, really appeals to the working class. And during this time, you see the separation of church and state. You see new religions that start to challenge Christianity, and you see a big revivalism movement that happens in response. It's kind of like the ideas that we saw back with the First Great Awakening, but this is the same idea, just more denominations that basically frighten the religious groups into wanting to revive and kind of reset a lot of that. So the Second Great Awakening had a couple of different characteristics to it. The first part of it is the frontier phase. These camp meetings, they were very emotional. Second Great Awakening had this meeting idea where they would meet out in wherever in the frontier, and they'd get together and they'd have these spiritual experiences and preaching and involvement with everyone, and it depended on where it was as to what kind of consequence or effect that you saw afterwards. With the North, you're going to see a lot more of those who lead towards reform movements. In the South, it was more of a socializing experience. The evangelists found that the audiences were ready to hear a lot of this. A lot of people were hungry for spiritual intensity, community feel. They were, like I said, they were unifying socially, politically, economically. Women were very drawn to it, and both Presbyterians, Congregationalists agree that kind of a lot on the same doctrine. It appeals to a lot of the big groups. Baptists embrace more simplicity, replace predestination with free will, equality for all before God, and congregation was the highest authority. So overall, a lot of the preachers are starting to adapt the earlier beliefs in the doctrine into a lot more free will, especially people like Charles Finney. He is the George Whitefield